In my last video, I was talking about the idea of new pieces of work which allow us to appreciate older pieces of work that might have gone under the radar, which might have been sort of cultish and not considered one of the greatest of all time in their time, but which later will grow to become that. And I was talking about video games and how right now the greatest of all time conversations are always dominated by games like Zelda, Final Fantasy VII, and Mario 64, which were hugely influential on the kinds of games that are still popular to this day. The sorts of 3D run-around adventure games that sort of originated with Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 in particular, and still dominate the landscape of video games to this day. But I was also saying it would be interesting if we started getting new games that don't really owe their origins to those, but to other games, and retroactively make those other games start to be more talked about. And of course, I then realized that this just happened in a really big way, thanks to a little game called Undertale. That is to say, Undertale with regards to its major influences in the Mother series. So, for the last few decades, this series of JRPGs called Mother has been a cult favorite, and never much more than that. If you ask anybody for a list of the greatest Super Nintendo games of all time, Earthbound, Mother 2 is always going to be on there, but because that game didn't have a lot of a clear legacy. It didn't have tons of games that were obviously influenced by it, and it's always kind of been loved by this small cultish fan base. I think it's always been left out of conversations about the greatest game of all time, even though there's a substantial portion of people for whom it is their outright favorite. And this is doubly so when we look at Mother 3, which was for the Game Boy Advance and has an extremely dedicated cult following who really, really, really loves this game. Now, the reason that it never blew up, at least over here in English-speaking nations, is that the game never made it out of Japan. It was Japan exclusive for a long time. It took a long time for us to get a fan translation. That fan translation kind of blew up, and there's a whole community around the game who loves it, but because there was never an official release, it's always remained a cult hit. One with a very vocal fan base behind it who tried to petition Nintendo to release it here and without success, but they've continually made so much noise about this game that it's been growing and growing in its cult status over the years. You can watch the great video by Happy Video Game Nerd from years back about Earthbound, where he kind of goes through the whole history of it, of the franchise, and how people have felt about it and the sort of battle that it's fought to try to be recognized as the classic that those people regard it as. Well, I think there was a huge upset in all that, because when you view something like Earthbound and Mother 3 as a cult favorite, it's a lot easier to leave it out of the conversation, because you can point to Mario 64, and even if there's only so many people who still care about it to this day, you can point to how many games it influenced and say, look at how important it is. And you can't do that with Mother 3. It's a game that only so many people know about, and no matter how much those people love it, it's not recognized as a gigantic, influential game. But now it's starting to be. Now it's starting to matter, because suddenly there came about these games that are hugely influenced by it, that are having a huge cultural impact and causing people to look back on Earthbound and Mother 3. This is Undertale, the bigger one, and Lisa, which also has enjoyed increasing popularity over the years, now that people have finally stopped just comparing it to Undertale and started actually appreciating it for what it is, both of which take huge influence from Earthbound. And when these games came out, all anybody could talk about is comparing them to Earthbound and Mother 3, because people were so excited to get a chance to bring these games into the modern conversation. And as a result, suddenly, those games are showing up on a lot more lists, a lot more greatest of all times lists. Over the years, they've been doing better and better in polls on game FAQs. You've been seeing them pop up in more, any niche community. If you go on V, for instance, and you look at their, lists of their greatest games of all time, Mother 3 is always right at the top. Not necessarily number one, but it's in the top 10 every time. Earthbound's always up there. So, these games are being more and more cherished, not only within niche communities, but now outsiders who are looking at Undertale and, this game that blew up really big and was voted best game of all time on a Game FAQs poll, have to go back and say like, hey, Mother 3 influenced this, and more people are playing it. For instance, my editor, the Devu, who absolutely adored Undertale and therefore went out of his way to go play Earthbound and Mother 3. And now that he's played Mother 3, he's calling that potentially his favorite video game of all time, you know, possibly beating out Undertale and another JRPG he's a big fan of, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. So, you know, that game is now getting more and more invited into the conversation about the GOAT. And it's really interesting to think that that's happening now because we finally have a link to it that we can say, hey, this new game that you all love is linked back to it. And it's even doing it, like Undertale is such a big deal because it's doing it for a bunch of different types of games that haven't been in the conversation, because Undertale is basically linked to mostly really niche game styles. It has a lot of elements of bullet hell, which means that bullet hell, which has always been like extremely niche game style, but like one that within that niche is extremely beloved, you know, suddenly people are talking about Touhou and its influence on Undertale. Suddenly people are talking about Yume Nikki and its influence on Undertale. You know, this game that is essentially considered the godfather of the absurdist core genre, but this is a crossover hit. This is a game that, you know, is a hit with everybody that's taking influence from these super obscure games and genres. And therefore now suddenly those have to be dug up and brought to the surface and looked at like, hey, this Yume Nikki game that for the last 15 years we've all been calling this quirky, weird, other thing that has nothing to do with greatest games of all time. Well, if it's influencing the games that everybody loves now, maybe we got to put it back under the microscope. Maybe it's not just a niche thing, but there's elements of it that appeal to everybody. You know, maybe anyone could get into it now that they know how, now that they have the means to appreciate it. You know, if you love Undertale for the fact that it is this explorative, minimalist JRPG that has all these elements of like, you know, stand in the right place at the right time and like and a certain thing will happen, that's very Yume Nikki. You know, if you have you want the quirky characters and dialogue, you want to play the Mother games. If you want more of that bullet hell, moving the heart around to dodge bullets, you go play Touhou and, you know, and other games like that. And so now all of these games are suddenly like, you know, under the lens to be like, these need to be in the conversation because these games are important because they're informing stuff that everyone knows is good now. So yeah, I do think we're seeing it happen with video games, that I think we're definitely going to, over the next 10 years, we're going to see Mother 3 climb up the GOAT rankings of video games all the time. We're going to see it like suddenly it's always there. Either at least Earthbound, you know. If Mother 3 ever gets a North American publication, like if they ever finally fucking bring it here, I think it'll definitely start showing up in the GOAT list because the hype wave will be unfucking surmountable if that game ever finally gets brought to something. You know, and even if not, more and more people understand piracy and hack. It's easy as shit to patch a GBA game, you know, like, so people are going to start getting into it, and I think we're going to see it eventually be considered among these greats. Even though this game was not recognized in its time, was not, you know, neither Earthbound nor Mother 3 was always at the top of these lists back when they came out, but they're going to make it there just by the strength of all the stuff that's borrowing from them. And as Undertale and Lisa influence more games, you better believe that whole lineage is going to keep getting more important. Suddenly, quirky JRPGs are going to be seen as like, you know, a touchstone of culture. And, you know, there's other games that'll do it too. Now that we just saw a huge rise in like everything Yoko Taro's done because of the hype wave surrounding Nier Automata. Like, I can't believe there was a hype wave surrounding Nier Automata, but it rode on the hype wave surrounding Platinum Games, which even that was a niche thing 5-10 years ago. And that only grew in the hype wave because it tied into the Metal Gear Solid hype wave, which Metal Gear Solid is crazy that it was ever a big deal in the first place. But think about it this way. Metal Gear Solid somehow became an iconic game franchise in spite of being totally fucking batshit insane. And Platinum Games, who made these very, like, niche-appealing, beat-em-up, classic-style, like, arcade-style games, but with, like, full 3D movement and really tight controls, you know, who were I knew about them from like God Hand and, you know, and their stuff back when they were Clover Studio, and then their, you know, Bayonetta and stuff like that, and Vanquish. But then they made Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, and suddenly they entered the Metal Gear continuum, and now everyone wanted to talk about Platinum Games, because anybody who loved the studio now had an opportunity to tie it into a popular franchise. So now Platinum takes off in its own right, because every games critic fucking creams their pants over Platinum. So now Platinum's riding high, and then they get to take the Yoko Taro franchise with Drakengard and Nier, which were games that, like, you know, everyone's still baffled that these even get made, because no one knows how they afford to keep making these fucking weird-ass games. That gets tied into the Platinum Games hype wave, takes off on its own. Now you got Nier Automata drawing all this attention to the fucking Drakengard games, and it's like, you know, we're having all these new games teaching us to appreciate these older ones, and so we're gonna see these continued swells of different old games being appreciated, new classics, you know, games that came out 15 years ago that are suddenly going to be beloved. And I think that's interesting and exciting, and I'm really curious to see, like, what games that'll happen to going forward. Like, what games will suddenly be considered massively influential that used to be considered niche. Only time will tell.